Welcome! In this video, we'll explain you everything about the London system. One of the systems which is going to be advised at YouTube for many starting players. You know, you go for a setup with bishop to f4, a pawn on d4, maybe c3, e3 to support the pawn, and develop a knight, get a knight at e5 at some point. And that's it, a very straightforward plan. But how do you counter this plan? That's what we discuss here. Because I think black has a very straightforward plan to equalize the position quite fast. I like the idea with the move c5, attacking the center of white right away. And as the bishop has moved already on move 2, the b2 square is quite weak, it's not defended. So that might also be a target for black at some point. White needs to act, and well, taking is not really an option. Because then after e6, here b4 is not really an option, because then you have a nice winning move. Do you see the move? Queen to f6, attacking the bishop and the rook. When you take the knight here, you take the rook, and when you retreat, then your queen is still active. You might gobble up some pawns. Black is simply better here. The computer likes knight to c3, and after knight to c6, e3, and takes. White has quite a good position, but knight c3 is against all ideas you get taught in the London system, because it blocks the c3 advance. So it's a different kind of setup, and not many people have played this. Actually, I've never seen this kind of play against the anti-London, as I call it. And here, knight to c6. Protecting the e5 square. In case of taking this pawn, you simply progress the e pawn to e5. And the bishop now has to move, and you can take this pawn now. And look at black's center here, which is protected by the knight and the queen. And black is clearly better here already, with 2 developed pieces and a great center. So that's not really an option. So white plays the move c3, as you get told to do in the London training courses. But in the anti-London, we here play bishop to f5. We activate our bishop. One downside of many of these d4 pawn openings is that black has issues with developing the white squared bishop. Here we've developed the white squared bishop right away. And this bishop is super strong. Knight to f3 and e6. We open up the pawn so we can develop our bishop at some point. And here we offer a bishop trade. This piece, the white bishop on the f4 square, is the strongest minor piece in white's camp. We would love to trade it off, as our bishop is super strong already. According to the computer, taking is best, because then we have to take back the pawn, right? If we don't, and let's say we take the bishop, maybe white can protect these pawns. But after taking back bishop e2, it's a completely equal game. But here, white goes back with the bishop to g3. A more thematic move, because you want to keep the bishop at some point, plant your knight on e5. That is the plan you get told to do. I don't really want to trade here, because then I open up the file. So that's not the best option for now. So therefore, I play the move knight g to e7, protecting the c6 knight, but more importantly, also leaving open the possibility of going f6 as soon as the knight lands here, right? I can go, it's not the best move now, but I have options to go f6 and kick away this knight and control the e5 square sooner or later, which I wouldn't have as an option if I would have gone to f6 with the knight. So this is a good move. And here, queen to b3, attacking one of the weaknesses in my camp, the b7 square, and I need to react here. First, I trade off the bishops, because, you know, if I, for example, want to protect the pawn with my queen, let's say here, then taking is an option, as this pawn simply hangs. So here I do decide to trade off the bishops first, and I feel that with the move h6 later on, the bishop can retreat and my position is quite stable. c4 would have been the best move here according to the computer. Attacking the queen. Taking is not really an option, because in this position we win back the pawn and our rook managed to infiltrate white's camp, the second row, and also the complete b file. And remember that this bishop is still protecting the b1 square, so white cannot really go for a trade of rooks. And after queen a3, I will go queen to b2, protecting the rook, and I have a strong position here. After knight b3, blocking the protection of the rook, I can go rook to c2. And the knight is now under attack. Knight c5, the knight is getting activated, but I can bring in my queen instead. And this is quite a nice position for me, a slight edge for black. Instead, I decided to take the pawn first and white takes back. The computer would have preferred to take with the c pawn, going for the open c file instead, but white preferred this option. It's about as good, so I don't really understand the question mark. It's about preference, I guess. Queen to c7, defending also the e5 square, as the knight now is threatening to land there, and also, making sure that the rooks are connected as soon as I castle. So development of the queen is always important. Bishop to e2, basically the only square. Well, you could go to b5, also an option, but after castles, some point a6 will follow. And yeah, if you, let's say, ever take, then, my knight also gets activated, because now this knight is not doing a whole lot. So I wouldn't really mind to trade off that knight. And here, the move h6. A very thematic move, making room for the bishop to retreat. In case of knight to h4, I can simply retreat here and keep the bishop on the very great and awesome diagonal here from h7 to b1. And instead, castles, castles. Maybe at some point, maybe the rook is gone now, but the idea of g4, g5 could be an option. Of course, the bishop now protects this square. We have to take it into account. But there might be an idea of white to use the h6 pawn as a hook instead. Rook to e1, and here the move a6, trying to create some room, and maybe going with the knight to c4, a great outpost, especially when it's protected by two pawns. So it's important in these kind of positions to have a plan, right? You arrive at the moment when the opening is over, right? Both players have a pawn in the center, the pieces are developed, the rooks are connected, so we enter the middle game, and you need to have a plan. You don't want to make single moves, but have a plan. So here the move b5 followed by knight to a5, and maybe c4 at some point is a plan. a4, immediately blocking black's plan, but also creating some weaknesses. And here I think this is a very good move, knight to c8. This knight in this position wasn't doing anything. It's protecting the bishop and the knight, but basically staring at its own pieces. So with the move knight to c8, I want to activate the knight and maybe go to e4 or c4, the very weak squares in white's camp. I'm rerouting my knight here. The bishop drops back, and indeed the knight goes to d6, threatening maybe at some point to go here, and also maybe protecting the advance of the c-point pawn at some point. The knight drops into the center of the position. It always wanted to go here sooner or later, and I decide to trade it off. I could go for rook here, for example, but after knight takes and queen takes, this is a completely equal game. Instead, I prefer to take the knight myself, and the computer would have liked to take with the pawn actually, and then knight e4, for example. This pawn maybe is a bit weak, but there is always protection in time with queen b4, for example, as the queen cannot really take, and this pawn is still under attack. But instead, my opponent took with the rook, and the computer likes the idea of going b5. So if takes, this rook is under attack. So either you trade it off, but then I get a really good open file. You cannot really take here, because then rook b8, right? So that would have been a good move, b5, but instead I decided to go for knight to e4. In my opinion, it always wanted to end up here. And the rook is a bit misplaced in the center of the board, surrounded by only white square pieces and pawns. Takes. And the rook is not really trapped because the e6 pawn is also a bit weak, right? So after a move like this wouldn't work, because then the rook can take here, and yeah, black's position collapses. My opponent goes for f3, kicking away the bishop, and the bishop goes back. I was talking before about this move, right? But that's only a good move as long as the knight is still on f3, because then it could go here, getting a tempo on the bishop. But the knight is gone. But here, in this kind of positions, you know, maybe the square of h5 could be interesting for the bishop sooner or later. And maybe also the field of f7 after my pawn at some point maybe progresses to f6. So I think the bishop to g6 is the right move here. King to f2. Yeah, bringing the king into the game is a good plan to do. And bring my rook here. The computer would have preferred to go g4. And after rook here, the game is completely equal. Maybe my opponent will go for g5 at some point, using h6 as a hook. But my position is quite stable and it's not easy to get your pieces on the h file. It's a quite costly and time-consuming thing to do. Instead, rook to e1, and here I go for the doubling up of the rooks. According to the computer, not the best plan, but it's a concrete plan and I like it. So queen to b4, and here I double up the rooks. And I want to go f6 at some point. Maybe the bishop also drops back to f7, supporting the d5 pawn as soon as f6 happens, and also protecting the king at some point. I like these kind of setups. Here the best move would have been c4, as it breaks open black's center, and I simply need to take. And I think me and my opponent both overlooked this move, because white is quite active here. Yes, it has an isolated pawn here, but it will likely go forward. And I have also a video on the IQP, how to play with the isolated queen's pawn, IQP, in this position white. So the camp with the isolated pawn wants to get rid of it by pushing it forward. So that will be the plan of white, and I think it's very close to accomplishing that already. Didn't happen. Instead, my opponent went for the move a5, blockading the progress of the b pawn. Maybe the queen will also go to b6 at some point to trade off queens. But here I go for f6, continuing my plan, and my opponent decides to bring back the rook. It has to, right, because it's being attacked. And here maybe bishop f7 is an interesting idea, but I go for e5 right away. Go forward. I continue my attack, and here again c4 would have been the right move, because after takes and queen takes with the check, white is very active here with after king to f8. But not what happened, and my opponent went for bishop to d3. Question mark, because it had c4, the better move in the position. I decide to trade, because now one of the rooks is out of the e file, and I have quite a strong push here along the e file. What is the best move in this kind of positions? Well, we can take, we can progress. Well, let's see what happens if we actually take first. Then there's a bunch of trades, and in the end this hangs. Now this pawn is also hanging, right? It's undefended, and my pawn is also undefended, and I cannot really defend it twice in one move. So take with the check. I have to take back, and yeah, this is a super drawn endgame. Equal number of pawns. The white rook is a bit more active, and while my pawn structure is a bit better, completely drawn position. So you shouldn't want to take here. Instead, I went for the move e4. Great move. It's in the spirit of the position, and this is quite a nice center. Taking the pawn is not really what you want to do, because after takes, I do have an active rook here, and white's king is a bit lonely and vulnerable over here. And well, my queen will simply join the position quite soon, and maybe I can get a nice attack in, although this pawn remains weak and is under attack by the queen, like this pawn as well, right? So it's quite double-edged. According to the computer, I'm slightly better here. Instead, the rook goes back as where it came from. I think it's the best move in the position here, f5. Protecting the pawn now twice. And black has a very good center. And what is then the approach you want to have as the camp who doesn't have the great center? Well, you want to attack the protecting pawns. So in this case, d5 and f5, the protecting pawns of the e4 pawn. If you manage to get rid of them, then the e4 pawn gets very weak. Here, the move b3 is therefore a very good move. threatening to go c4 at some point. And the computer in this position would love to see the move rook to d7. Because now you prevent the c4 progress in a tactical way. Why? Well, c4, if you take, and you take back with the queen, with check, then now this pawn is hanging, and this pawn is attacked as well. And if you, for example, will take with the pawn, then also rook to d4 is a good option here. The best option for white would be to go rook to c1, setting up the pin, but then still you simply take the pawn. But after rook takes, there's a bunch of trades in this position. And still black is better, a pawn up in this position, and a slight advantage. Instead, here I played the move king to h8. A very slow move, but also a secure move, and making sure I get rid of some open diagonal over here, but not really in the spirit of the position. So that's why the computer didn't like it as much. c4, attacking the defending pawns of the center pawn. Great move, and I need to act. Here the computer would have loved to see rook to d8, but then queen to b6 is a nice move. Trying to go for the queen trade, but queen to c8 solves some tactical issues here. As white wants to take here, then I simply have a really good move here in the end. If white takes the pawn, because do you see the tactic? And with this check you win a rook. Not this rook, because it's defended by the pawn now, but you win the other rook with the check on c2. You cannot go in between, because then the rook hangs with a check. And if you go back, there's another check. You can't really go here. Well, you can, but then there's a check here. And the rook falls, and if you go there, the rook falls by the capture of the rook. But instead, here I went with f4, attacking the rook, attacking the pawn, and white needs to act. It took back the pawn, and I take back with the queen. And now, this pawn is pinned, right? So it's not really attacking this pawn at the moment. So that's an important detail. Here my opponent made a big blunder, queen to b6. But do you see why? Well, white's king is very much vulnerable here. So we have checkmating patterns over here. And what's the first move we start with? You always in these kind of positions think in the following sequence: checks, captures, attacks. Let's first see if we can give a check. Yes. Queen h4 check. And yeah, well, white either walks away or blocks the check. Let's see what happens if the check is being blocked. Well, then a check here and king f1. And what is an amazing move here? Simply taking this pawn, because we threaten checkmate here. If you take the rook, this is a checkmate. So this is very much game over. Instead, you have to defend this square by going here, for example. And then, yeah, well, you simply win the rook. And taking doesn't help, because this is a checkmate as well. So blocking the check is not an option. The king goes back instead. The best option in the position. But do you see a brilliant move in this position? Yes, the same as in the previous sequence of moves. E takes f3. Why is it such a good move? Well, if you take the rook, don't be greedy here and taking the rook back, because this is a drawn position. Because there's a check here and you attack the rook. It's not completely lost though, because you will progress with the pawn here. And this should be a draw according to the computer after rook f7, because you simply trade the rook for the new queen, and this should be a draw after queen takes on d5, but very double-edged with passed pawns over here and the passer over here, but white's king is very much in the center of the board. No, instead you give a check here, the king has to go forward, and now you take this pawn with the check. And now the king has no squares to go to except for this field, and by going here, the defense of the e7 rook is now blocked, so you can actually take the rook. This is not an option because white is in check, and after king to d3, this was not an option, right? Protecting the rook because of the queen. You simply win the rook, and this pawn progresses, and there's not really hope for white for any draw, because we can simply hide here and there's no repetition of moves. I hope this was a very helpful analysis for you for the anti-London system. Check it out yourself. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and see you next time. Bye bye.